Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. If you like our content, please share with your like-minded friends and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe also to our Substack, where we have a repository of many resources available for further study. To date, in the League of Biblical Enthusiasts, we have a total of 5 series available for your content. A total of 82 longer form videos and 28 short form. First, we have the history of the English Bible, which includes many videos on Bible translations and discusses the translators and their qualifications, translation philosophy, and working procedures. We cover the likes of John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, Martin Luther, Erasmus, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Matthew's Bible, the King James Version, the Geneva Bible, and more as well. We even cover modern versions like the ASV, Authorized Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version, the NIV, and on we could go with these acronyms. But we also include some single author translations like the Moffat Bible, E.J. Goodspeed's translation, Kenneth Taylor's Living Bible, Richmond Lattimore's Gospels, the Cotton Patch Gospels, and others. A second series features manuscript hunters and collectors, with episodes featuring Robert Curzon, Constantine Tischendorf, the Sisters of Sinai, Solomon Schechter, and many more. In addition, we discuss collectors such as J. Pierpont Morgan, Charles Freer, Chester Beatty, Martin Bodmer, and our third series on cities of the New Testament. And today we have covered Jerusalem, Nazareth, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Cana in Galilee, and Caesarea Philippi. Our fourth series, which is rather new, is archaeologist interviews. And our first was with Dr. Thomas McCullough, director of the Khirbet Kana excavation. Today we introduce our fifth series, and I call it Books in My Library. We summarize, you learn. Our focus for this episode is Naomi Shepherd's 1987 book entitled The Zealous Intruders, the Western Rediscovery of Palestine. And the subtitle reads, From Napoleon to the Dawn of Zionism. The explorers, archaeologists, artists, tourists, pilgrims, and visionaries who opened Palestine to the West. Naomi Shepherd, and here's the younger Shepherd on the left and a more recent picture on the right, was born in Cardiff, Wales, brought up in London, and is a graduate of Oxford University. She taught in the Department of English at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she now resides. Last week, we introduced Chapter 1, and today we pick up with Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, she introduces us to 6 explorers in the early 19th century. And they are, in order, Ulrich Seetzen, Jean-Louis Burckhardt, James Silk Buckingham, Irby and Mangles, and that would be Clifford Irby and James Mangles, William Banks, and Lady Hester Stanhope. So we begin with Ulrich Seetzen, considered the first scientific explorer of Palestine. Seetzen was a German physician who had studied botany and medicine, and also Arabic and Islamic culture before his trip to the Holy Land. Side note, Seetzen claimed to have converted to Islam later in his travels, but this could have simply been a ruse in order to gain access to certain sites and important people. Nonetheless, his stated goal was to collect antiquities, geological specimens and plants, and to note ancient inscriptions. He reached Damascus in the fall of 1805. On his first excursion into the interior, he visited the region northeast of the Jordan, where he noted old inscriptions and sketched columns of the classical ruins. He and his entourage were soon taken hostage by Turkish horsemen, but were soon released after providing proof of their documents. The following month, he set out again, this time disguised in the clothes of an Arab sheikh, And here's a typical example of the look he was going for. He succeeded in exploring the territory, the northeastern borders of Palestine. He stopped at the ruins of ancient Caesarea Philippi, then called Banias, and today is Banias as well in Arabic, where he noted the niches in the rock-faced cliff dedicated to the Greek god Pan. The League of Biblical Enthusiasts recently featured an episode on the archaeological work done at Caesarea Philippi, at, of course, modern-day Banias, and please see that episode for much more information. But this area was unseen by any European since the Crusades. Seetzen then traveled south through Tiberias. He crossed over the Jordan in hopes of discovering the lost cities of the Decapolis, a region mentioned in Matthew and Mark. This was Bedouin territory and quite dangerous. Shepherd describes the Decapolis of Seetzen's day. These were the remains of what had once been the farthest outpost of Western civilization, strung out in a line between Damascus to the north and Philadelphia, which is modern-day Amman. In the hills east of the Dead Sea to the south, they had marked a flourishing trade route and sheltered a flourishing Hellenistic culture, described by Pliny, Josephus, and familiar from the New Testament. Their fate before Seetzen's time was uncertain. Seetzen dressed as a common beggar to avoid attention of Bedouin and other robbers, and thus, on that long winter trek in 1806, he became the first European to identify the Greco-Roman ruins of Gadara, Gerasa, which is modern-day Jerash in Jordan, and Philadelphia, modern-day Amman. The ruins of Jerash in Jordan are particularly impressive, and I'm showing here a 19th century photo. And here are some modern photos of Jerash. Here is, for example, the Arch of Hadrian, and next, the colonnaded street. And then we have the Oval Forum. And finally, here's a wide view of the ruins with the modern city in the background. But Seetzen is not yet done. In 1807, he was the first modern traveler to completely circle the Dead Sea. He went on to the Sinai and visited the monastery of St. Catherine, where he penciled a note on his wall saying that he was the first to travel here in a direct line from the Dead Sea to Mount Sinai. He remained in Egypt for 2 years, where, disguised as a merchant physician, he traveled widely in the Nile Valley and prepared for his most dangerous journey to date. That would be his pilgrimage to Mecca, which he reached in 1809. And here he was able to escape death by sketching the holy site without being noticed. But his good luck, unfortunately, would not last. On a trip to Yemen in 1811, he was murdered, allegedly poisoned by his guides on orders from the Imam of Yemen. Fortunately for us, he prepared an account of his journey, and it was published in 1810 for the Palestine Association of London. You can find it at archive.org. Next up in Shepherd's list is Jean-Louis Burckhardt. Burckhardt, a Swiss, was from a wealthy Basel family who made their fortune in the silk industry. Burckhardt's great ambition was to discover the source of the Niger River in Africa. In 1809, he secured the backing of Sir Joseph Banks, president of the Royal Society, and a key figure in encouraging African exploration. Burckhardt went to Cambridge to start learning Arabic so he could pass himself off as a Muslim. He left England, traveled to Aleppo, Syria, to perfect his Arabic and understand more of Muslim customs. En route to Syria, he stopped in Malta and learned of Ulrich Seetzen, who had left Cairo in search of the lost city of Petra and had been subsequently murdered. Once in Syria, Burckhardt adopted the alias Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah to hide his true European identity. Now, how a fair Englishman could get away with that is beyond me. but let's give him an A for effort. Burckhardt was the first modern European to rediscover the ancient Nabatean city of Petra, which Seetzen had searched for in vain. And Shepherd describes his discovery this way. Burckhardt was now, he suspected, very near Wadi Musa, where Petra was rumored to be situated. In order to persuade his guide to choose the route through the wadi, he told him he had vowed to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, which he knew overlooked the valley from the west. Together, the two men entered the narrow, curving pass at the eastern end of the valley, which led to the lost city. Above them, hundreds of niches in the rock face signaled to Burckhardt that he had indeed stumbled upon a necropolis which surrounded the city, and as the valley widened, he caught his first glimpse of the ruins. As the temples and magnificent tombs hewn into the rock face came into view on either side of the path in the valley, Burckhardt marveled silently at the wonder of the caravan city. Now, here is a painting by the famous David Roberts of the 19th century of how Petra likely looked to Burckhardt. And I'm showing now 6 more modern-day photos of Petra, a spectacular sight indeed. It's the kind of see before you die place. It was Seetzen and Burckhardt who realized that local Muslim peasants preserved many biblical place names in Arabic. And this realization would be key to later historical geographers as they mapped current sites to their ancient biblical cities and regions. Burckhardt is also known for being the first European to provide a detailed description of Mecca, which, like Seetzen, he visited in disguise. Burckhardt died of dysentery in Cairo in 1817 at the young age of 32. He left only unpublished notes, but they were edited by his patrons back in England and published in 1822 as Travels in Syria and the Holy Land. Very little was known about the discovery that were made by Seetzen and Burckhardt at the time of their death. And here is where Shepherd introduces James Buckingham. James Silk Buckingham. The sensational discoveries of the classical ruins east of the Jordan were first revealed to the public through Buckingham's works. His work, Travels in Palestine, was published in 1821, 1 year before Burckhardt's book. Buckingham was a sailor and journalist who, along with William Banks, reached and retraced the area east of the Jordan where both Seetzen and Burckhardt had been. Banks was disguised as a Turkish soldier and Buckingham as a Syrian Arab. And Shepherd tells us this. Soon the travelers came to Gerasa with its temples, colonnades, theaters, arched buildings with domes, detached groups of Ionic and Corinthian columns, bridges and aqueducts, and all its impeccable classical style. Banks managed to sketch the city and Buckingham to make detailed notes. Both men realized that in Gerasa they had found a classical city of great importance and whose description that might make Banks' reputation and Buckingham's fortune. However, the conditions under which they carried out their brief survey were not such as to ensure careful and scholarly assessment. The two men eventually departed and went their separate ways. Buckingham arrived in India, where he wrote up his travelogue, Travels in Palestine, and it reached the English publisher John Murray in 1818. But even though Murray had in front of him a very tantalizing travel narrative, which would be quite important to the public, he hesitated to publish. Buckingham notes contained unflattering comments on the Latin friars in Jerusalem, going so far as to allege that they had kept prostitutes for themselves in Bethlehem. He was also unflattering to his traveling companion, William Banks. But nonetheless, the book was published by Murray in its entirety at the beginning of 1821, but it was decidedly not published by the Quarterly Review, which Murray also published. Shepherd notes that Buckingham's travelogue was, quote, immediately a popular success, but not with the Quarterly, which tore into Buckingham with all the avidity of a Bedouin plundering his victim. Buckingham was described as an ignorant, pretentious scribbler, quoting from sources he did not understand and locating places which he had probably not seen. The Quarterly pinpointed more than 40 errors in his text. Now, meanwhile, William Banks wrote a venomous letter to Buckingham accusing him of theft and plagiarism. He claimed that Buckingham copied his notes that he had left on a window seat in the monastery in Nazareth. All this was quite juicy for the London elite to devour. Buckingham fought back and sued Banks for libel, a case he eventually won, and for which he was awarded substantial damages. And Shepherd says, as for Banks, by the time of his defeat by Buckingham in the law courts, he had another cause for mortification, and this was a private publication in 1823 of an account of travels in the East by two young naval officers, Charles Irby and James Mangle. Once more, Banks appeared in the role of a learned bystander in a book he should have written himself. Banks made acquaintance with Charles Irby and James Mangle in Aleppo in 1816. They decided to travel together and retrace Burckhardt's steps in order to make a more detailed survey of Petra. They wore Bedouin dress, and after tough negotiations with the Sheikh of Wadi Musa, they were allowed to enter the region. Banks was well suited to record a more scholarly version of Petra. He had a master's from Trinity College, Cambridge, and was an amateur architect, a careful epigrapher, and had mastered the art of copying ancient inscriptions. In fact, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in March 1822. But it was not Banks' account of Petra that first reached the public. It was Irby and Mangle's. Their account was the first to capture the Western imagination and was published by John Murray in 1845. And that work was entitled Travels in Egypt and Nubia, Syria, and the Holy Land. Although Shepherd does not write about the details of Banks' life, it is true that in 1841, William Banks left England, effectively exiled, after being legally declared an outlaw as a result of his failure to appear for a trial for homosexual activity, a crime which carried the death penalty. So our last account of a famous, perhaps infamous traveler is that of Lady Hester Stanhope. The story of Lady Hester Stanhope is a short one in Shepherd's book, so let's provide a little background before going to her story. Lady Hester Lucy Stanhope, born 1776 and died 1839, was a British adventurer, writer, antiquarian, and one of the most famous travelers of her age. Her excavation at Ascalon, modern-day Ashkelon, in 1815 is considered the first to use modern archaeological principles, and her use of a medieval Italian document is described as one of the earliest uses of textual sources for field archaeology. She came into possession of a medieval Italian manuscript. It was copied from the records of a monastery somewhere in Syria. And according to this document, a great treasure was hidden under the ruins of a mosque at the port city of Tel Ashkelon, which had been lying in ruins for 600 years. In 1815, on the strength of this map, she traveled to the ruins of Ashkelon and persuaded the Ottoman authorities to allow her to excavate the site. And this resulted in the first archaeological excavation in Palestine. And Shepherd says, quote, her only discovery, a headless statue of Hadrian, she had promptly had smashed and thrown into the sea, for by this time the removal of the Parthenon frieze by Lord Elgin had been denounced as vandalism in England itself, and Lady Hester did not wish to alienate the Turks. She lived out the rest of her life in the town of John, Lebanon, and here's a drawing in the 19th century of that city. But unfortunately, she became destitute and died in her sleep in 1839. Well, that's chapter 2 in a nutshell. Chapter 3 of The Zealous Intruders is entitled Palestine and the Authentication of the Bible. And Shepherd introduces us to Edward Robinson, his partner Eli Smith, and some other very interesting characters that you will find most informative. This will be our next episode. So I hope you are enjoying this book summary of The Zealous Intruders by Naomi Shepherd. I would really love to know your thoughts on this idea of a series dedicated to giving some summaries of what I consider important books in this field. So if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel, share with your like-minded friends, and also subscribe to our Substack, where we keep a repository of sources, information that goes a little deeper than what we can give you here. There's lots of material to follow up. Until then, stay healthy, keep curious, always learning, and we'll see you in the next episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts.